Okay, everybody in Hall 2, welcome back for the Human Factors in Diving Conference. And for this next presentation, we have Dr. Mike Rothschild. Dr. Rothschild is a pediatric otolaryngologist, or ENT, or in Greece we say orila, or as he just told me, he's a snot doc. Well, I like that. That's pretty good. That's his Instagram handle. So I'm sure he'll go into that. In New York, he's also a active technical rebreather diver. He's past president and dive chair of New York City's Sea Gypsies. So if you see a bunch of gypsies walking around and they have something to see, then he was president. And he's a medical moderator. He is a medical moderator on SCUBAboard.com. He has published a number of articles and papers, most recently one on mixed rebreather and open circuit dive teams. And he has created and distributed a sticker for rebreather checklist diving. So I will turn over the stage now to Dr. Rothschild. Dr. Rothschild, welcome aboard. It's all yours.
Okay, Ray, thank you very much. Thank you, Brian. And let me just share my screen here. Here we go. We good? All right. All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for having me. And thank you for coming to my talk. And to Gareth, thanks for asking me to speak. And I'm going to start my talk about checklists and how they can save lives, as you might imagine, with a discussion of my breakfast. So normally what I have for breakfast is oatmeal. I take a quarter cup of oatmeal, 1/2 teaspoon of flaxseed meal, and 3/4 cup of water. And then one day I was thinking about some stuff. There were a few recent deaths in my family, and I had some mildly concerning medical news. There were some financial issues with my practice, and I had a frustrating dive the day before, and the usual background stuff, pandemic and politics, climate change, everything. So this was my breakfast that morning. I took a quarter cup of flaxseed meal and 3/4 cup of water. And I finished about half the bowl before I realized I had made a mistake. Here's another example. This is my old camera housing, my old Ica-like camera housing. It was kind of a simple design, a clever design. The dome port had an O-ring that sat sort of loosely in a groove underneath the dome port, and it was kept in place by water pressure. And this is what I used to do, my usual housing prep. I put the camera in the housing, I put the O-ring in the dome port groove, and then I put the dome port on top of the housing. Then I clicked those tabs that hold the port in place, and then I would go diving. And so one morning I was thinking about this sort of stressful conversation I'd had with my fiance the night before. So this was my housing prep that day. I put the camera in the housing. I thought about the conversation with my fiance. I put the dome port on the housing. I clicked the tabs to hold the port in place, and I went diving. And then, of course, step 6 was I got a new camera and housing. So, you know, silver lining, but still, it's always better not to skip critical steps. So here's my checklist. I mean, a checklist for my talk about checklists. Here's my checklist for the talk. And look, we've already checked off one thing. So you're getting close to the end here. Examples of process failures. I'm going to talk a little bit about what critical processes are, at least how I use the term, and some problems with human dependency. Then we're going to talk about aviation, surgery, and diving. We're going to talk about the first modern checklist. I'm going to talk about aviation and surgical checklists. Then some general information about terminology, designs, and limitations of checklists. And then we'll talk the diving part, which is, I assume, what most of you are here for, diving checklist, and some closing thoughts, and obviously some time for questions. So a critical process, people use this term differently. I think of it as a sequence of interdependent events where there's the potential for catastrophic outcome. And these can be human independent processes. They can be processes that are designed by human beings or that are dependent on human beings for their execution. So like catastrophic failure of a human independent process, well, you know, the Earth goes around the sun and comets go around the sun, and sometimes those orbits intersect, and, you know, not much we can do about that, but certainly a recipe for disaster. And then you have things like this, the Challenger disaster, where the problem was sort of in the design and not so much the immediate human operation of the design. And then there's things where the actual failure is a human one. And I know many of you have seen Gareth's amazing documentary, If Only, and we're very lucky to have Ashley Buggy here speaking as well. But this is sort of what we're going to get at this kind of talk, the kind of catastrophes that are caused by human factors. The problem with these critical human-dependent processes is the thing in the middle, is this piece of equipment in the middle. It's an amazing piece of equipment. It can do incredible things, but it's also prone to spectacular failures. It's something that would definitely not pass CE certification. So the problem is that it works differently depending on a number of things. If you're hungry, or if you're angry, if you're sick, if you're busy, you're hungover, you're distracted, you're running late, you're kind of skipping steps, normalization deviance, a lot of times that'll change how this incredibly important thing in the middle of the process works. So what is one way of making sure that critical steps always happen correctly? This is the only one of two rhetorical questions in this talk. And that is, of course, you can check the title of this talk to get the answer to that question. That is a checklist. And so the rest of this talk, I'm going to talk about the role of checklists in trying to limit harm to when the human brain doesn't always work well. So in the course of describing checklists, I'm going to focus on three activities where physical printed checklists have been used: aviation, surgery, and scuba diving. Now, in aviation, they have been near universally used for decades. They're mandated by authorities. Most pilots accept them. They're usually done pretty efficiently and accurately. Surgery, this is a more recent thing. Since around 2009, they've been more and more widespread. Now they're fairly universal. They're mandated by external authorities. They're accepted by surgeons, somewhat grudgingly by some of our older surgeons. And they're done with variable degrees of accuracy. Scuba diving, not really so much. I mean, they're used mainly by some rebreather divers. They're not mandated by anyone, and compliance with them seems to fall off as you get further and further out from training. Interestingly, if you look at these three activities, how we sort of investigate these catastrophic failures, they also vary quite a bit. Aviation, federal investigation of every crash is mandated by law. Surgery is a little more self-policing. We have our morbidity and mortality conferences, but there are hospital boards and the Department of Health, and there's the Joint Commission. There are some adversarial entities. Malpractice attorneys may be looking at our failures and trying to figure out what went wrong or make a case for how that who was at fault. In scuba diving, at least in the United States, and again, I'm sorry for being somewhat United States centric, but there's really no independent investigations unless you suspect foul play, which doesn't happen very often. There's no consistent system for reporting fatalities. There's not even a good way of reporting non-fatal incidents. So it's hard to get good data. It's hard to do much science with scuba diving failures. So anyway, I participate in two of those three activities, which is presumably why Gareth asked me to speak. I do not participate in this activity. I do not like flying. I do not like heights. I don't even like ladders. But I did learn a lot about aviation for this talk. If you have any actual questions about aviation, it seems there are a lot of people there, especially our leader, who is a former RAF instructor, and he will talk to you about real information about aviation. Now, aviation surgery have a lot of similarities. They both involve complex processes. There are a lot of critical steps. There's an established hierarchical culture. There's a big reliance on technology. They both use checklists. There are big personalities and big ego in both of these fields. There's a lot of confidence, and there's a lot of overconfidence. And of course, there's the potential for catastrophic failure. Now, there are differences. And no matter how badly a surgeon screws up in the operating room, they're probably going to survive. Okay. In aviation, I went and asked my cousin Bob, who is a pilot, and I asked him, I said, isn't it terrifying? You're flying a commercial airplane and you know that hundreds of people's lives are in your hands. And Bob says, hey, when I'm up there, I'm worried about my life. Those people want to come along for a ride, that's up to them. So that is a difference between aviation and surgery. So let's start with talking about where checklists came from. They haven't been around forever. So this is a prototype airplane. This is called the Boeing Model 299. You may recognize, those of you who are aviation buffs may recognize it as the B-17 Flying Fortress, which is what it eventually became. But before it was the Flying Fortress, this is October 30th, 1935, the Army Air Corps was holding a competition. They were going to award a new long-range bomber contract to one of three companies, Boeing, Martin, and Douglas, and Boeing was the clear favorite going in. The early tests had shown it to be very good. This was somewhat of a formality to actually have the competition. So the 299 took off with a 7-man crew. In command was Major Ployer Hill. He was a decorated, very experienced test pilot. He was actually the chief of the Wright Field flying branch. And observing him on board was Leslie Tower, who was the chief test pilot for Boeing, the company that developed it. So some good people on board there. Now, here's something I learned about flying, and this was something that the 299 prototype was designed with. There's an advanced design at the time, something called a gust block. So airplanes are fairly light to get up in the air, and they have these control surfaces like flaps and rudders, and they bounce around in the wind. So they don't get damaged. There are these things called gust blocks, which keep them from flapping around, and obviously to make the aircraft unflyable. and you got to take them off before flight. You can see it says right there, remove before flight. So Major Hill did not disengage the gust locks. He took off, climbed to about 300 feet, kept on nosing up into a stall, flipped over and crashed, and both Hill and Tower were killed in the crash. So, pilot error, right? It's pilot error. And that's the easy answer, but it's usually not a very helpful answer. And if you just automatically go to that, and that's sort of the whole idea of just culture and most of the rest of this conference, and Garrett will tell you a lot about this, the problems with blaming and just assigning something to pilot error or operator error, it can cause you to miss systemic problems. So if it's pilot error, well, what we need is more training. We need better screening. We got to get better pilots. They got to be certified more to fly these more and more complicated airplanes. Well, I mean, here you have like the top test pilot in the Army who was under direct observation by the chief test pilot of the company that actually designed the aircraft. So you're probably not going to get better crew than that. So the conclusion that they came to was that the Model 299 was just too complex to fly safely, relying on one pilot's memory. And this is how the checklist was born. They had an amazing insight. Okay, they said, well, let's plan for failure. Failure is going to happen. Let's plan for it. Let's assume that it's going to happen. It's going to happen to the best people despite their best efforts, and we're going to design systems that limit harm, not if, but when it happens. So a group of test pilots came up with this checklist, and that saved the aircraft design. It actually saved Boeing from bankruptcy. The Army eventually ordered 13,000 of these. It made it to the B-17. It gave the U.S. an air advantage, probably helped win the war, and it had an excellent safety record after that. Actually, the idea of checklist was a new thing then, and it's notable enough that here Life magazine did an article just to tell people, hey, look at this new thing that pilots are doing, and they just published the whole checklist, cockpit conversation. So this was notable, and it really helped. So I figured, okay, well, that was 1935. What's going on here now? So I went to Cousin Bob's son, Cousin Steve, who was also a pilot, and he sort of brought me up to speed on this. He said, a lot of these break down the sort of tasks and processes into three categories. There's memory items, and that's something that you need to be able to do very rapidly. There's not time for a checklist. If you're taking off and you have immediate engine failure, you need to be able to deal without reading a list. And then there's sort of these QRC items. These are quick reference checklists. They're short processes. They're on a single page. If you have an engine failure in flight, there's a few things you need to do. And they pull that quickly. And then for more complex things that are less urgent and may happen over a longer period of time, you have the QRH level processes. This is the quick reference handbook, and this is where they actually pull out a manual and go through things, something like low oil pressure or something that doesn't require such urgent care, but definitely needs to be done. Steps need to be done in the right order. And he says in recent years, a lot of the things that were memory items have been pushed over to QRCs. That's sort of a nod to the fallibility of human memory. So anyway, thanks to Cousin Steve for that. Okay, now let's talk about surgery. Well, in surgery, we're a few decades behind the pilots, but over the past 10 years or so, surgical checklists have come into being. They sort of, you can trace their development to the World Health Organization's 2007 project. They had this Safe Surgery, Save Lives project, and then subsequently released a model surgical checklist in 2008. And there are three things that they wanted the checklist to do. And one is you want to make sure that they're completing commonly skipped steps. And they really realized that a lot of morbidity and mortality, deaths and complications in surgery are because just something simple wasn't done. You're supposed to give antibiotics before the incision. People just forget, if it's a difficult induction, they might not remember to do that. Didn't forget to do pulse oximetry or call the blood bank to see if the blood's available for a case where you anticipate a lot of blood loss. So that's a simple thing for a checklist to do. I mean, that's, any checklist will do that. But more important, two other things: promoting communication between the team members. And this is where I was talking about culture. I mean, you can imagine operating room culture. It's probably a lot like the cockpit culture. In the past, you had one person, the surgeon, who was sort of running the show. And, a lot of people might have been very hesitant to speak up or correct that doctor. So the checklist, the idea was to promote communication between the team members, which makes a big difference. And then it decentralizes power and control, pushes responsibility out from the center to the periphery, and recognizes that all team members, do have important roles in contributing to safety. And that's a real cultural shift. And that's something that I've seen happen in the operating rooms over the past decade. Many of you may know this guy. This is Atul Gawande. He is an endocrine surgeon at Harvard. He's also the author of a number of best-selling books. He's a great writer. He's a staff writer for the New Yorker magazine since the 90s. He's also the senior author of the article that the WHO published on surgical safety checklist project. This is that article came out in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2009. And we were also lucky enough to have at this very conference Simon Mitchell, as many of you know, a professor of anesthesiology at the University of Auckland, New Zealand. He has made a number of contributions to technical rebreather diving, dive safety, hyperbaric medicine. Really a treasure, and I'm very lucky to have him on the panel. He was also a member of the original World Health Organization Surgical Safety Checklist Study Group, and this is his article on that, so looking forward to that. So surgical checklists, they emphasize shared responsibility. They encourage all the team members to speak up on safety issues. And if you look at the data on this, there's tremendous evidence of harm reduction. You really are picking up low-hanging fruit, stuff that was admitted and picked up by a checklist. And then if you look, like most things that look great at the beginning, people start studying it and saying, okay, what are the limits to this? What are the problems with it? And there's a bunch of literature on problems in implementing checklists, problems in design, unintended consequences, what are their limits of applicability, but they still catch errors and save lives. So make sure you don't miss Dr. Mitchell's talk. This is Dr. Gowende's book. It's called The Checklist Manifesto. It is a very short book. He is a terrific writer. If you are interested in this stuff, I strongly urge you to pick it up and read it. And he gives a lot of examples of checklists in aviation, but also in construction, in restaurants, in finance, and of course in surgery and critical care. So in it is the story of the World Health Organization's Surgical Safety Project and his involvement in it. But the main message is, as our endeavors become bigger, the days of the master builder are over. A master builder was, in the pre-20th century, you put up a big structure like St. Peter's in Rome or the Capitol building. There was one person who was just good at everything. You know, to do the windows and the doors and the structural stuff and the environmental stuff. And we've really progressed beyond that. Our buildings have gotten so complex, our operations, our airplanes have gotten so complex that no one person, no matter how skilled, can just handle limitless complexity. And the insight that all human brains are fallible has led to the conclusion that the best way to promote safety is to standardize our best practices and promote communication and teamwork. And that's critical for safety and success. And that really involves, as we'll talk about, a cultural shift, not just printing out a checklist and giving it to people. You need decentralized power, diffuse responsibilities. This is the World Health Organization's surgical safety checklist as it came out in 2009. And, you can imagine it has a lot of the same things that you might see on your aviation or diving checklist, the same ideas. And I don't really mean to go into it in detail, but I want you to look at the last line because this is critical. It says, this checklist is not intended to be comprehensive. Okay? Additions and modifications to fit local practice are encouraged. And that's a critical feature of good checklist design. So I'm going to ask, this is another rhetorical question. I mean, those of you who aren't surgeons might assume that antibiotics and prepping the field with an antiseptic and sterile technique, that's just important for all surgery. That's basic surgery 101. You got to do that for everybody. Well, I mean, to a degree, yes, but there are differences. So like here is total hip replacement. You can see the surgeon is wearing a sort of spacesuit, and there's a lot of attention paid to prepping the whole leg and draping and sterility and whatnot, and antibiotics I'm sure are given. And this is the kind of surgery that I do. And while we still obviously keep things clean, you don't have the same kind of requirements. It doesn't make sense. So there is no one size fits all for surgical safety checklists. So what kind of problems can a checklist fix? Well, there's sort of three problems that a checklist is good at fixing. One is the simplest one, inadvertently omitting a critical action. It's a complicated process. You forgot to unlock the gust locks or forgot to give the antibiotics for surgery. And, oh, here it is on the list. Yeah, remember, release the gust locks. Whether you're fatigued or distracted or sick or mad or just a failure of memory. I mean, we all have limits to our memory. That checklist will pick that up. And then there's normalization of deviance, and that's a whole lecture into itself. But the idea there is you skipped a critical step before without a problem, so eventually you're just going to sort of start skipping it. Well, here it's going to remind you that this is an important step. You got to do it even though you got away with skipping it before. And then communication. Checklists promote communication because instead of like one person insisting on a communication or insisting on a dialogue, especially if that person is external to the group, like an administrator saying, you guys have to talk. It's an inanimate object. It says here, oh, we all have to follow this. So that means it formalizes the discussion of potential problems. It encourages input from everybody, not just top down from the leaders. So when don't you need a physical written checklist? Obviously, every activity is going to come up with some conclusion about whether a checklist is appropriate or not. And it's usually a combination of the complexity of the task and the potential risk. Now, backing a car out of a driveway is a very high risk activity. I mean, you can easily kill somebody, you can kill yourself, but it's fairly low complexity, so you probably don't really need a checklist for that. For some, writing a novel, it's a very complex task, but unlikely to kill somebody with your novel. I'm sure there's an exception that proves the rule. So scuba diving, that's what we're going to talk about later, whether that fits that description. I want to talk a little bit about terminology, because these terms are used a lot in checklist design, and you see them coming up and again and again. The pause point. So a pause point is a point in the process where you're supposed to stop everything and run a checklist. And it can be natural, like, pre-flight checklist or pre-incision. We always run the checklist at this time. Or it can be a triggered pause, like when an emergency happens. If the engine goes out in flight, that's going to trigger the use of a checklist. There's something called the forcing function. And this is an engineering term. It's an aspect of design. It basically is something that deliberately interferes with user activity so you can avoid bad outcomes. What the idea is that processes become automatized after a while. You do the same thing again and again, you tend to get rote about it. So by interrupting that performance, it brings any danger to consciousness. And here's an example I'm going to show you. Before going to the building for the past year and a half at our hospital at Mount Sinai, you have to open up a little app on your phone and do this COVID exposure questionnaire. Everybody has to do that every time they come in and show it to get admission to the building. The problem with something like that, especially automated thing, and you'll see this in sort of automated electronic rebreather checklists as well that are integrated into the handset, is that eventually people want to be efficient, so they develop workarounds and they re-automatize. And you've seen like people sort of memorize, oh, okay, to get the rebreather going, you just click the left button 3 times, the right button 6 times, the left button 7 times. That defeats the whole purpose. Here is an example of that app. So when I go to the building, I get this thing, and I'm supposed to go and enter my equipment, my information. So I put my life number in there, I put my name in here. Okay. And then it's going to ask me a bunch of questions. And of course, by this point, I'm doing this for a year and a half, and I know I haven't been exposed to COVID or whatever. I'm not reading these things anymore. I'm just clicking no, 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 submit, and I get my pass to go in for the day. Okay, I kind of know, I would know if I had been exposed, if I was sick, but that after a while, since you're forcing everybody to do the same thing over and over again, very quickly it becomes routinized, and that's a sort of a design failure. Terminology, there are 2 basic types of checklist. There's the do confirm checklist, and here you're talking about tasks that are done from memory, and then the checklist confirms that you did every task. And this is good for processes you do all the time, where you're probably going to remember the steps, and if you forget a step, you can always do it later. So there's a pause point at the end to just make sure you've done all the steps, like the pre-surgical timeout. It's important to give the antibiotics a certain amount of time before the incision. It doesn't have to be a long time before, but it has to be, it can't be done just as you're doing the incision. So if you forgot to give them when you normally would have, say a half an hour before, as long as somebody's going through the checklist, say antibiotics given, oh no, we forgot to do that. Okay, let's give them now. It's okay, you can do that. That's fine. That's a do confirm checklist. It's just to make sure you did all the steps. And then there's a redo checklist. This is more like a recipe. You're reading things down from a list and then you're doing them. And this is good for sort of complex processes that have very critical elements, high risk of harm if they fail, and they have to be done in the correct order. Especially good if it's a process that you're not doing every day. So like an in-flight engine failure would be a redo checklist. Sort of an expansion of that is the challenge and response, or the redo confirm. And I think Simon's going to show a video of that. This is an enhanced version of redo. And basically the team members are backing each other up. It takes more time, it's less efficient, and one of the problems with this is you have 2 team members have to do this, as opposed to having, if there's multiple tasks that need to be done, you can't split up the work. You both have to concentrate on this one thing, but it is a good way of making absolutely sure that really critical things have been done. So Bob says, open the oxygen valve, and Steve opens the oxygen valve, and then Bob checks it, and then Steve reports the oxygen valve is open. So it's a call and response, or challenge and response, or redo and confirm. All right, what makes a bad checklist? Because we see a lot, certainly in surgery, we see a lot of bad checklists. I'm sure the pilots see some bad ones too. If they're too long, and again, if you want somebody to do a checklist and be functional, 5 to 9, these are sort of the number of chunks that we sort of think of as the maximum number of things you can keep in your head at a time. So if you want this to be a usable checklist, if it goes much more than a minute and a half, it's less likely to be usable as a pre-flight checklist. Again, we're not talking about the longer pre-build checklists or QRH type checklists. You want to make sure there aren't non-essential items in there, because there are some things you want to do, but if it's not really an essential item, eventually the list becomes too big and you miss the focus on the critical steps. And similarly, too much detail. I mean, this is not a substitute for an instruction manual. This is to make sure that nothing serious is missed before you go to past the point of no return, before you go past an irreversible threshold. Ambiguous wording is no good. The checklist tasks should all be pretty clear about what they're referring to. And it's also important that the checklist be customizable, both in their design or even on the fly. There are some checklists, I mean, you can't make a checklist for every possible type of surgery, but like, for instance, if somebody has antibiotics given or not given, and I'm doing a tonsillectomy where we don't give antibiotics, if it's forcing me to say yes or no, I mean, if I just say no, that looks like I didn't do it, whereas not applicable, that should be an option. And that makes checklists much more applicable widely instead of a one-size-fits-all approach. And it means you don't have to come up with a different checklist for every possible sub-process. Here's an important one. A lot of checklists are made without any design input from someone who actually does the activity. I mean, if you want a great way to make a checklist that's clueless, you have it done by somebody who's like having me make an aviation checklist. And then, of course, ongoing refinement is important. You got to make sure that there are updates for new technology, edit any erroneous content, because otherwise you're going to have bad practices sort of ossified checklists. Now, limitations. These work well for relatively short processes with unvarying steps, with highly motivated individuals where there's a potential for catastrophic failure. They don't work well for very complex processes where there's a lot of variability and ambiguities. And if there's no motivation to adopt a checklist, you're going to have low compliance. Checklist fatigue. If you do too many checklists, especially ones that aren't well designed, people are just going to routinize their workarounds, and you'll have the veneer of safety. You can say, oh, look, we have a checklist, but you're not actually making things safer. It's also important that if these are implemented by an external authority, and again, not so much an issue in diving, but it was in surgery, and then combined with a failure to understand the culture that you're putting this checklist into, you're just going to get frustration, resentment, and pushback. And if you look at the proceedings, I put some examples of articles that reviewed that in surgery and why checklist fails. Because if the head of the hospital, who's not a doctor, comes in and says, "Here, you got to do this checklist. I made it with my golf buddies, and this is important because the JACO says we got to have it," and he doesn't. That's going to backfire. It's also important that if there's urgency of action, you got to know when a checklist is going to cause more harm than good. So here's an example of that. This is Transair Flight 810. Happened just last July. It's a cargo flight, left Honolulu with a crew of 2. It was an older twin-engine 737, and one of the engines failed on takeoff. So air traffic controller cleared them for immediate return. They were about 5 miles out. The crew decided to run a checklist. So they pulled along the QRH version checklist. There was multiple systems involved, and they just kept on going, running the checklist. So they got about 20 miles out and decided, yeah, we got to turn back. So they turned back then, and they lost the second engine on the way back in, and they ditched into the ocean 2 miles short of the runway. And fortunately, both of the crew members survived. And since this is a diving conference, I know what you're thinking. 410 feet, forget about it. And now we're going to talk about checklists in scuba diving. And so many of you know Pete Mesley. He's probably serenely running checklists in his mind right there in Deco over a wreck at Truck Lagoon. Recreational scuba diving. Okay, this involves a multi-step technical process. It's very dependent on human memory. There's a risk of catastrophic failure, obviously. Now, checklists are common in scientific and commercial diving, and I'm not really talking about that. I'm really talking more about recreational diving. Scuba diving is, as we mentioned before, different from aviation and surgery. Even team diving, it's a solitary activity. You can't really share the responsibility like you can in an operating room or a cockpit for the critical parts of the actual diving itself. And the equipment is more non-standard. A lot of people dive equipment that they've designed or built themselves. And while this also varies by country, in the U.S. there is no external regulatory oversight of diving, itself. I mean, yes, a dive operator is going to tell you you can't dive off my boat if you do X, Y, or Z. But if you get your tanks filled, I mean, you have your own boat. There's nothing's going to stop you. There's no external oversight. So a lot of people talk about mnemonics when they think about checklists. And I don't personally like mnemonics. The one that most people in general recreational open circuit diving think about is that WARF one, BCD, weights, air, releases, final okay. GUE, which as many of you know is an agency, one of our sponsors here, very, very good at formalizing processes. And this is their mnemonic, which talk a little bit about later, but it's a goal, GUE EDGE, goal, unified team, equipment, environment, decompression, gases, exposures. Now, I mean, I like the effort here, but the problem with mnemonics in general is these list items often are ambiguous, and in order to force them to fit, an acronym that sounds clever, you have to kind of use things that, okay, well, what does this mean? Okay, they're telling me that this means that because you want it to fit into the acronym word, but it's easy to misremember, especially if you have the same letter multiple times, also important, there's no physical object, which really enhances compliance. There's not a lot of research on this, but there is one randomized trial where they looked at 3 groups, one with no checklist, one with mnemonics, and one with written checklists, and they showed a significant benefit of written checklists over mnemonics and no checklists, which came out about similar in the error rate. One thing mnemonics do is they sort of help you by slowing down the pre-dive procedures. Just slowing things down is often enough to get you to pick up errors. And then, it's like, what was that mnemonic again? Was F fins or D fog, or what is final OK? I mean, it can be hard, and you can do the same input and get many different outputs, again, because that thing in the middle, that human brain, doesn't work great. Checklist, always going to see the same thing. Now, I'm not sure of the makeup of the room, but talk a little bit about open circuit versus closed circuit diving. Open circuit diving, the failure modes are pretty apparent immediately. If you're sucking gas in your regulator, not getting any gas, you know it. There aren't a lot of critical steps in assembly and use. There are a few. If you look at open circuit divers, there's a huge range of user training, skill, and motivation, from the highest levels of technical cave diving to people who have just done a few discovered divings and decide to get a basic OW and go once every couple of years. So there's a big range. You find written checklists very rarely recommended or used. Closed circuit diving, as many of you are rebreather divers knows, you can have a lethal failure mode that you don't know about because you're moving air and you don't know what that atmosphere is doing if you're not monitoring it carefully, and some things are very difficult to monitor. They're complex machines. There are a lot of critical steps in building and operating them. And again, this also varies, but most people who dive rebreathers are very highly motivated. They're usually technical divers, and I would say they have pretty good diving skills in general, although those skills are significantly degraded once you start diving closed circuit. Written checklists are commonly recommended in closed circuit training. Their actual use is not universal, unfortunately. And there are different types of rebreather checklists. In the interest of time, I'm not talking about the build checklist. That's sort of a long, detailed, unit-specific thing. I'm talking about the pre-splash checklist, the pre-flight checklist. It's a short, critical steps common to many rebreathers. I mean, the build checklist is important too, but it's sort of different. It's beyond the scope of this discussion. So I have 3 stories that got me thinking about checklists in recreational diving, and what caused me to go on with my project. This would happen in a local quarry near us, Dutch Springs. You may know about it. There was a rebreather diver standing in waist-deep water with his teenage daughter on the loop. His O2 feed line had become disconnected, and I guess he wasn't monitoring his PO2, and he lost consciousness. He fell forward into the water, and he was rescued by a nearby group, fortunately. And this was posted on SCUBA board. The person involved was very helpful in sharing this. This is a wonderful thing. By the way, if you're ever involved in a near miss, please share your information. It really does save lives. Technical driving instructor rushed in to get in the water with his buddy, and there had been previously an issue with his set point equipment mechanism. He didn't notice the dropping PO2 level, lost consciousness within a few minutes. Fortunately, he was pulled from the water, resuscitated. And most of you know about Brian Buggy, and he was an experienced rebreather diver, Navy officer doing a trimix training dive. He splashed ahead of an instructor with the O2 shut off and the rebreather in surface mode. He lost consciousness and unfortunately was lost. Please hope you see Ashley's presentation. It is amazing what she has done. I just want to thank her to take your personal tragedy and make it your mission to save lives. It's incredibly admirable, and we're all very grateful for your work. So anyway, I decided, well, I'm going to make a checklist sticker. And I didn't call this the checklist sticker project. I called it the Changing Rebreather Culture Project. And you can go to my link in the materials. I have all this stuff on my diving website. There are a lot of checklists around. I mean, dive companies make them. The rebreather manufacturers make them. The training agencies make them. So you can get these checklists everywhere. Why aren't we using them? Well, I think there are 4 reasons. One is ego. I mean, a lot of people feel checklists are for newbies. That's not for me. I don't want to wear a checklist. I don't use a checklist. Then there's faith in technology. I mean, rebreather's getting more and more complicated, more and more sophisticated. A lot of people think, well, my rebreather's going to pick up any problem. It's going to take care of that stuff for me. I mean, if you need one of those cards, you need 2 hands. So it's hard to gear up holding one of those things in your hands. And also, it's not that convenient. What do you do with that little card? At the end of your checklist, do you clip it off? Do you put it in your box? It's very easy to lose. So there's a problem with those physical cards. This is a picture of me taken by my buddy Alice Chong. You can see I have the Royal Order of the Newbie there. I had clipped that off to my rebreather, and it shows that I have my checklist with me. but I can see how people might be a little bit reluctant to do that. So this was my checklist sticker project. So it's basically just little stickers you put on the controller. It's always there. You can't forget it. They're cheap. I'll mail someone to anyone who will tell me that they'll use them. They're customizable. If somebody's going to use them, I will send you the Word or the Photoshop files. They're printed with waterproof ink on paper. They stay on pretty well. If they come off, you can always put another one on. Critically, they don't require a free hand. They're simple, but it has all the critical pre-splash checks. And there aren't any ambiguous items forced into acronyms. It doesn't have to be put away or carried at the end. And this is, I guess, both. It's good that no one has to notice you're using it, but on the other hand, you should show people you're using it. I mean, you want to change culture. You want to push back on that notion that, it's a mark of shame or a mark of a newbie to use it. So if you really don't feel comfortable somebody seeing you using it, hey, it's right there. Nobody's going to notice. I am a big believer that it should be done after putting on the rebreather. I see a lot of people doing these pre-splash checklists with the rebreather on the bench, and you can roll off valves, you can disconnect lines. You should be ready to go before you do your checklist. Last thing before entering the water. Now, GUE, as I said, this agency is famous for standardizing protocols and equipment, so they have multiple checklists. And I'm not a GUE diver, but I spoke to a buddy of mine. I think he might be here, Eric. There's the pre-dive checklist. That's the build checklist, where you go over all the things you do to putting your unit together. There's an on-site checklist, which repeats some of the items from the pre-build, from the build list, but you're doing it every day of diving. Then they have their own mnemonic, which I said before I have a little problem with, but I can understand, wanting to do some of those safety items from memory. I personally prefer having everything on the sticker, but I'm far be it me to criticize GUE. They know what they're doing. And then they have a sticker, which is like mine. I don't know whose came out first, but they have this great sticker that goes in the same place. So great minds think alike. That's where their sticker goes. And that's their critical control check or pre-splash or pre-flight check, the things you want to make sure are working before you jump in the water. So kudos to GUE for actually formalizing this. And I think this is better than a lot of other training agencies have done. These are my checklists. You can get them printed up on special paper. This is I got done from one of those diving sticker companies, where you can just print them up on commercially available printed paper. So yeah, those are great. I mean, I like them, and I've gotten a lot of good feedback on them, and I'm happy with a Google contribution. But doing this talk got me thinking about it. Well, there are all these emergency procedure checklists. Why don't we have them for diving? Why don't we have underwater checklists for emergency procedures? Rebreather training stresses the practice and the memorization of emergency procedures. And if you go, one of the great resources for rebreather divers is from the Megalodon website, where they go through this failure tree analysis, and it's basically a list of several dozen failure modes and the flow charts, which are sort of like checklists of what you need to do when when each of these things happens. Now, they obviously don't expect you to take their website with you diving. The idea is you're supposed to memorize these. But the thing is very few divers really commit the time or resources to practicing these enough to shift them into the memory items category that the pilots use. And I know people will say, yes, I practice all the time, but I mean, realistically, it's just hard to do. We all have limited time. We want to actually dive for fun. I mean, the only reason we're doing recreational diving is for fun. So I always wonder if somebody says, I drill these constantly. I'm not so sure that many people actually do that. But even given that you do that, well, what is an underwater emergency going to cause? It's going to cause panic, and that's going to affect performance. And then rebreather emergencies in particular, where you have problems with CO2 levels or oxygen levels, they're even more likely to affect brain function and performance. So, the pilots don't realize that. They don't rely on memory at all times. They don't rely on their amazing training for everything. So why are we? Some things are always going to be memory items in diving. I mean, throwing a BOV, if you feel funny, okay, we're not going to run a checklist for that. That's a bailout valve. For those of you who don't know, that's basically switching from a rebreather diving to open circuit if there's a problem with your rebreather. That you have to be able to do in an instant, even if you're already feeling kind of funny. But there are a lot of things that you just don't happen that often. And the problem will happen over enough time. In other words, you're not having an immediate problem breathing, that you could run a short, easily accessible checklist if it was available. Something like the pilot's QRC items. And I can anticipate the cultural barriers and the pushbacks. I mean, people say, look, if you need that, you shouldn't be diving CCR. You hear that particular phrase all the time. There are some things that's true for, but clearly this is a problem. Deaths happen, and Pilots figured this out. Surgeons figured this out. There's no reason why it couldn't happen. And let me go through one way this could happen. We already have some checklists built into our dive software. Pause points and forcing functions. I mean, these are some high POPO2 or a stack time alarm. These come up in a this is a Shearwater interface, but other companies I'm sure have similar things. So what's the pause point there? Well, the pause point is high PO2. High PPO2 triggers a pause point, and it triggers an error mode. You not only get the actual readout, but you get an alert. And then to go on to keep diving, to go back to the screen that gives you the third row, you have to push the button on the right, confirm. That means, okay, I saw it. It's a forcing function. Okay. So you get that alert, you push the button, and it goes back to the original screen, but you're still seeing the high PPO2. But the computer is sort of forcing you to acknowledge that error. So could we incorporate more explicit, more interactive checklists into rebreather controller software? I'm not an engineer, but this is just an idea that I had. So here you're diving along, and you have your threes for those non-rebreather divers. The middle row is the PO2 reported by each of the three sensors. You have redundancy, so this particular breather has 3 sensors. And the first one says 131, the second one says 1.29, the third one says 1.05. So that's out of range, enough out of range that it turns yellow, which means it was voted out. The software has said, okay, majority rules, doesn't always work in diving, doesn't always work in politics, but majority rules, we're voting out that one. We're going to make all our calculations based on an average of the other two, which we're going to consider are just still good. But it doesn't have to go that way. What if it went like this? Suppose when you got that alert that one cell was out of range, it automatically gave you the option of running a checklist. So you got an error, you got your pause point. Should we run? It's asking, should we run a checklist? So if you want to run a checklist, you click on confirm. Okay, so it's running the checklist. This is number 6. It's running. Number 1, are you having any cardiac or respiratory or neurological symptoms? If so, bail out to open circuit. Now, those are kind of big words. You might want to work on the wording for that. Or do you feel strange, weird, or panic? First line of the checklist, anything like that, bail out to open circuit. That means stop diving the rebreather, breathe the known gas, and then figure out what's going on. Okay, but say you're not. So let's go next. Okay, it's telling you, well, do a diluent flush. So diluent flush means you're basically replacing all the gas in your loop with a known gas, your diluent, which you know what it is, you know what its PO2 is going to be at the depth you're at. So it's always going to be safe that you set up your dive so that it'll always be safe to breathe at any point of the dive. Do a diluent flush. Okay, well, I'm going to do my diluent flush, and I click on next. Now it's asking me, did you do it? Because it doesn't know you did it. It knows that the reading changed, but it doesn't know that I actually did it. So I have to say, yes, I did the diluent flush. Okay, I did the diluent flush. Next. Okay, now it's telling me, okay, well, it's telling me, well, cells 2 and 3 are matching what we expect the diluent PO2 to be. So we're going to presume that they're accurate. And cell 3, I'm sorry, that's a typo. Cells 1 and 2 match the diluent PO2. Should be presumed accurate. But cell 3 is not. So I get my options now. I can bail out to open circuit, finish the dive on my bailout, or I can continue with 2 cells, which is an option and might be appropriate in certain situations. So just to finish up, checklists are speed bumps, right? And speed bumps, the term has both a positive and a negative connotation. Speed bumps deliberately slow things down and they save lives. Real speed bumps on the road, they save lives. But it's also a term used as a figure of speech. It means an obstacle that blocks progress. And checklists can do that too if they're poorly designed. So in aviation and surgery and diving, checklists deliberately slow down our mental processes. A good checklist is supposed to give you time to get it right. And I just want to address one thing. A lot of people think that standardized procedures means you're not thinking anymore. And, they feel that, oh, well, I know what to do. I don't want to just follow a list. I don't know if you know this guy, but this guy is why I'd be willing to bet virtually every human being listening to me is alive today. This is a guy named Stanislav Petrov. He's a former lieutenant colonel in the Soviet air defenses, and he was working in September 26, 1983 at an early warning site, a Soviet early warning site, and they got a report that 5 ICBMs had been launched from the United States, which, in fact, that's fake news. It did not happen. But, his protocol, his checklist said, okay, well, you see that. I'm supposed to report that as a first strike up the command. And if that had been done, the doctrine at the time, mutually assured destruction, their checklist, his commander's checklist, would have been to launch an overwhelming nuclear attack on the United States. And because of a number of considerations, he decided to wait for corroborating evidence, and he did not follow the checklist. He did not report the alert. And so the spoiler here's that the world did not end on September 26, 1983. I want to finish up with some words from Tolga Wende's Checklist Manifesto. And I think this really sums up, why checklists are useful and why we should try to incorporate them into diving. We're all plagued by failures, by missed subtleties, by overlooked knowledge and outright errors. We have imagined that little can be done beyond working harder and harder to catch the problems and clean up after them. We are not in the habit of thinking that the way the Army pilots did, as they looked on their shiny new Model 299 bomber, a machine so complex that no one was sure human beings could fly it. And they too could have decided just try harder or just dismiss the crash as the failings of a weak pilot. But instead, they chose to accept their fallibilities. They recognized the simplicity and the power of using a checklist. And when we look closely, we recognize the same balls being dropped over and over, even by those of great ability and determination. We know the patterns, we see the costs. It's time to try something else. So try a checklist. And that's my talk. Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Fantastic, Doc. Very nice. Good topic, the checklist issue, especially as a rebreather diver myself. Yeah, the checklists work. In open circuit, it's another issue. But we do have a question here presented by Kevin. So let me see if I can invite Kevin here to the stage. So Kevin, is your turn. User's already in the room.
I hope it's not about aviation.
I don't know.
Hi, Kevin. Can't hear you. And unmute yourself.
You can unmute yourself in your panel there, Kevin.
Nope. And I gotta say, shout out to the Alexco people. I really like this platform. It's kind of a breath of fresh air after a year and a half of Zoom. Let's see. Nope. Kevin, you want to sign it? Email me. Well, anyway, while he's talking, I'll just mention if you have any questions for me, feel free to get in touch with me. My contact information will be in the materials. My Instagram, which is about a third diving, a third ENT, and a third COVID stuff, is Snot Doctor. I should have put that up on slide. Snot Doctor. You can ask me questions there, and I'm always happy to talk about. Most people ask me about ENT problems in diving, but I'll talk about checklists. Chris.
Okay, Doc. There's another one here, Chris.
Hi, Chris.
Hi. Thanks very much for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. I've got a medical question.
Okay, go ahead.
to do a checklist.
What's your insurance? I need your insurance card. Can you just hold it up to the screen?
Oh yeah, sorry. I work for NHS.
It's America, right?
Advantage of the NHS, it's free. I was very fortunate to have two identical operations actually done by the same surgeon, 9 years apart. Once sort of before checklists, or before checklists were really accepted, and once 5 weeks ago. I had 2 kidney transplants.
Oh, wow.
And one of the questions I asked was about, do you use checklists for the second one? Because obviously I'm human factors, and do we do it? And they were like, absolutely, yes, we do. We use it a lot. One thing I've noticed, interesting, because obviously I've seen the checklist, and it says at one point, anybody can challenge any of these things if you don't see it being happen. One of the things I noticed during both the prep for the operation, but also afterwards when people were doing rounds and various other things, I noticed a lot more people were contributing to the information. Everybody from nurses who 9 years ago, I don't think I had heard speak during the whole, I was in hospital over the last one for like 3 months. I didn't hear them say anything other than, yes, I've written that down or something like that. Do you think that the checklist part, which gives people permission to challenge, then spreads out into the rest, or is there sort of something that's made both of those things happen?
No, absolutely, and that's an excellent insight. And by the way, if you haven't read the Checklist Manifesto, it's a very quick read, and it talks a lot about that stuff. And I think you'd really find it fascinating. It talks a lot about surgery. The guy is a brilliant writer. So yes. The simple part of and that was in the World Health Organization project from the beginning. The simple part of checklists is, did you give the antibiotics? No, I mean, you don't need a doctor, you don't need anybody. You can actually build that into an expert system. But the more important contribution of checklists, and that's why I talk a lot about culture and breather culture and operating room culture, is that people, all team members, even the less exalted ones, traditionally less exalted ones, save lives. people pick up stuff all the time. Even everywhere, there's something called catch, which is like you're supposed to, if you see somebody going through a room without washing your hands, what is the janitor, the food delivery person you can tell anybody, no matter who it is, hey, you didn't wash your hands, and do it. And that absolutely has saved lives. And plus it makes it a nicer place to work for people. I mean, there are some older surgeons who are used to being God in the operating room, and questioning them was, big flying to rage. And those guys are dying out. You don't really see those guys anymore. You occasionally see somebody throw a fit in the operating room, and it's considered bad, and you don't last long in a position of authority, and it's not good for the patient, as you said. So yes, absolutely, that pushing authority out to the periphery is. And I don't even like to use the word, that's Wendy's word, pushing the periphery, but that implies that nurses are some of the periphery. They're all integral parts of the team. They have different responsibilities.
Yeah.
Very good question, Chris.
Brilliant, thank you.
Everybody in the hall, and of course, Dr. Rothschild, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. Dr. Rothschild, I invite you to the Human Factors in Diving Conference lobby, which would be on the first floor. So if you look at your screen on the top, it has the lobby, and there's a booth for the last Hall 2 speaker. So I ask you to please go there, and anybody who's in the hall that did not get to talk to Dr. Rothschild, Dr. Rothschild can entertain you for as long as he feels he needs to.
My next patient's at 1. I got plenty of time. All right, I'll see you over in the lobby. Thank you again. Thank you, Ray. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Gareth.
Thank you, Doc.
Bye-bye.
For everybody else in Hall 2 at the top of the hour, we will start with Dr. Frauke Tillman for her presentation. So we'll see you at the top of the hour.